I'm very happy today to be introducing Philippos Koliopanos. Philippos studied for his undergraduate and master's degree at the University of Athens, the Department of Physics, where he worked with Apostolos Mastichiadis. And then he moved for his PhD studies to the Max Planck Institute for Astrophysics at Garching, where he conducted his PhD work under the supervision of Marat Gilfanov and also our inaugural Kilafis lecturer, Rashid Sunyaev. And upon his graduation in 2015, he moved to France, to Toulouse, the Institute of Research in Astrophysics and Planetology of the CNRS, where he has been an XMM Newton Research Fellow since. And today we're very happy to have him with us to talk to us about accreting compact stars and the evolution of structure in the universe. So without any further ado, Philippos.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me in this seminar. All right, so let's get started. Behind my work and this talk is concerns, well, as the title suggests, accretion-powered relativistic stars or compact objects, and I will speak a bit about my work and the general format of and the current situation of our field. Now, this kind of pompous title I've selected may not be very clear as to what I want to say, so I'll just give a hopefully helpful overview of what I plan to talk. First of all, I want to set the premise of why I'm arguing that these sources can have a global effect, if you like, on the universe. I will set this up by presenting some major open questions in this sector, which I argue are of interest to the entire field of astrophysics. There's one thing I want to try to convince you today is that these problems can be of interest to people whether they're in the high energy X-ray astronomy, etc., or not. Give us a small overview of how we study these accretion sources, biased by, well, the way I do it, and briefly mention some of my works with my collaborators and some of my future projects. But before all this, let's just start from the beginning. Very quick reminder, compact stars. Well, these are the relics of stellar evolution. Stars, as we know, at the end of their life, depending on their initial mass, they can collapse into either white dwarf or, in more massive cases, a neutron star, or in when they cross the Untitled limit into a black hole. Now, these are extremely compact objects with well, basically are testing the most extreme environment in terms of gravity. Black holes basically are in the limit between the quantum world and the GR world, if you like. So they're excellent test beds for all kinds of physics. The neutron stars are basically city-sized nuclei, so the matter of which they are formed, understanding exactly how it's made of, place is a test for all kinds of physics and the standard model. So they're very interesting in and of themselves. But what I want to say here is that under certain circumstances, they can become much more than just a physical curiosity or an exotic object. And that circumstance is when they come into contact with matter, when matter is accreted on them, as we say. One of the most common cases of this, and throughout our galaxy and other galaxies, is in binary star systems. These are known as X-ray binaries. So this involves normal, so to speak, stars, non-compact star that has a relativistic companion, a neutron star or a black hole, sometimes a white dwarf. Now, in some cases, it's a very massive star, donor star. These are the high mass X-ray binaries. In this case, you may have very strong winds expelled from the massive star if these are captured from the companion, which is almost always, or at least 90 something% of the time a neutron star, and actually a highly magnetized neutron star, this material is accreted onto the compact object. Now, in less massive cases, the low mass X-ray binaries, you can have a main sequence star or a giant star, and if it's close enough with its companion, it can basically overfill its Roche lobe and starts losing material through the inner Lagrangian point, and that material is carried over to the companion. Now, since these objects are in orbit, there's angular momentum. Due to this angular momentum, the material that falls on the compact object forms an accretion disk. And these accretion disks are the main source of the ionizing radiation that, as we'll tell you in a few minutes, has the pronounced effects on their surroundings. Now, this stellar-sized accretion example has its supermassive counterpart with a completely same scale invariant mechanism in the center of galaxies and their supermassive black holes. These are black holes with millions or sometimes even billions of solar masses. If material is captured by this, if there's, well, material is available and is accreting in these sources when they're active, known as active galactic nuclei, we get this phenomenon in a grand scale. So to sum the two up, compact objects, when they are accretion powered, as we say, can have a powerful impact that not only exceeds the gravitational sphere influence, but actually has cosmic scales. For example, X-ray binaries have luminosities, sometimes millions of that of the sun, or even higher, primarily in the X-ray part of the spectrum, but they emit throughout the electromagnetic spectrum. Since they are accompanied, for example, by relativistic jets, which is as you can see in this artist depiction, which can have high energy emission and also radio emissions of all sides of the spectrum. And also we expect winds, material being expelled from the disks. Now, on their supermassive counterparts with million solar mass black holes, when these titans, as a colleague calls them, accrete matter, they can actually become thousands of times brighter than the entire galaxy that hosts them. This image here is basically a composite where you have radio image, which you can see jets from an AGN, you can see obscuring material from the galaxy, and also you have X-ray and optical in this image. So it's this ionizing radiation and these outflows that can influence star formation rate. Therefore, they can influence their entire host galaxy in their evolution. And we can see their effect, if you like, in this very beautiful image from Rosita. We can look at the X-ray sky and the abundance of these sources, which this includes, of course, our galactic X-ray binaries, but AGN emission, high energy emission coming from very, very high distances in the universe. So this, okay, so we make this general statement. Okay, so you have ionizing radiation, you have massive outflows, and they can have some feedback on the surroundings. Well, the question that's becomes interesting, if we can quantify it, how exactly do they do that? So what is the impact of the X-ray emission, which means basically depends on the spectrum, hard X-rays, soft X-rays. How massive are the outflows I mentioned, and are they, you know, how energetic are they? What's the velocity of the expelled material? And also, another question is important, what drives them if they are there in the first place? So these questions that can help quantify this argument can basically be replaced or answered, if you will, by answering one single question, which is more interesting and more fundamental, which is, how do supermassive black holes form in the first place? And to make it a bit more specific, how do they form within just 700 million years after the Big Bang, which is when we object the furthest quasars at about redshifts higher than 7? The answer to this question is if all my research would boil down to one question at the and would be trying to answer perhaps this question. So let's start trying to see how we can go about this. Well, first of all, we cannot have a progenitor for an object that's hundreds of million solar masses. So these things have to grow via accretion of matter onto something smaller. At some point, mergers will also increase. But the point is, these cannot start the way stellar mass black holes begin. So a perfectly normal question is to ask then how fast they can accrete. Is their rate limited by something, or given available material, how fast they can accrete? And what I'm hinting here is a key crucial concept of this study and my work specifically, which is known as the Eddington Limit, which is a very simple balancing argument that applies to all gravitationally powered sources. But in the case of accretion sources, basically it's quite simple. As accretion rate increases, the objects become more luminous. And as the radiative pressure becomes equal to the ramp pressure of the infalling gas, at some point, this will interrupt the accretion. Now, a major question is, can we exceed that limit? And more importantly, can we exceed it in a persistent manner? And later on, I'll present sources that appear to be doing that. Regardless of that, in any case, what we'll certainly expect is massive outflows when the objects exceed this limit due to the immense pressure of the radiative force. And based on the observational indications we have so far, we expect a sort of softer X-ray spectrum from sources that seem to be accreting at super Eddington rates. So adding this second little box to the initial question, the fact that now we need accretion to something smaller, and there might be some limitation or not to this, we can reformulate the initial question in a question of the initial seeds. Namely, and the reason for this basically is that if we start this process with anything that's more than 1,000 solar masses, you need to have this seed be accreting constantly at the Eddington limit from the first moments of the universe to the time we detect the sources. This is, and that's a nice exercise actually for students if they're interested to estimate this. Now, the Eddington limit depends only on the mass of the central object. So these sources have to either accrete constantly throughout the lifetime of the universe by the time we observe them, or they have to be able to cross that limit persistently for long periods of times or for shorter bouts of hyper-Eddington accretion, basically accreting hundreds or thousands of times about the Eddington limit. This, of course, if is the case, predicts all sorts of outcome like relativistic outflows, and if the soft X-rays could yield an excess of free electron, promote molecular hydrogen, and therefore promote star formation, for example. So this is one effect they can have. Now, on the other hand, if we can start from something more massive, 100,000 solar mass black hole, for example, if somehow pristine hydrogen gas can remain unfragmented, and there are scenarios that allow us to do that until it collapses into this very massive seed, then via moderate accretion, we can get the supermassive black holes form within the time we detect them. In this case, though, emission is expected to be harder. Usually that's the case in a more moderately accreting sources. Harder X-rays have a very large mean-free path. They ionize the intergalactic medium. They can heat up material to the point that it can actually have a negative effect on star formation. So this is, from one scenario to the other, we can have a completely different impact on their host galaxies. So the discussion of seeds brings me to the second crucial point of concept, if you like, of this field and my research, which is the so-called intermediate mass black holes. Now, we know of the stellar mass black holes. We recently have observed many of them merging, and a very interesting merger recently, which reached quite high mass. And of course, we know about the supermassive black holes. We even took a picture of the event horizon of one a few years ago. So the question has been for some time now, if there's a population somewhere in the mid-range, like thousands or hundreds of thousands solar masses. And with this additional concept in a discussion, we can again reformulate once more the initial question. So we want to find out the effects of accretion powered sources in a grand scale. And to understand that, we see that the key question is the formation of supermassive black holes, since they are intertwined with the evolution of galaxies since their very beginning. And to understand how these form, a crucial part is the understanding the size of its initial seeds. And a crucial step to estimating what these seeds are is looking for a population of intermediate mass black holes. In this very nice diagram by Mar Mesqua here, you can see why we mentioned this. So you can start either with small type of seeds, or a more massive in the case of direct collapse, and then through process of accretion and merging, you end up with the population of supermassive black holes by redshifts up to 7.5, or whenever we observe them. However, we expect a population of leftover seeds, black holes in the centers of galaxies with quite merging history, with quite accretion history, low luminosity, AGN, for example, in which the central black hole might be should still be close to its initial mass. If we can find that population and understand its demographics, its mass range, we can get a clue as to how supermassive black holes form. So basically, our initial question, at least within my research, boils down to two things: a search for intermediate mass black holes in the center of galaxies in order to find whether they are lighter or heavier, and of course understanding how super Eddington accretion can, or if it can become a viable mechanism for formation of supermassive black holes. So how do we do this? How do we answer these questions? How do we study these objects? And how can we measure their mass in order to understand how the impact they have? Well, I present here a quick biased overview of methods, which are basically, well, general methods, but also the methods I tend to use. Major part is X-ray binaries used as accretion laboratories. Since the mechanism is scale invariant, these objects offer, first of all, variability within human timescales, diverse environments, speaking about neutron stars or black holes, or magnetized neutron stars, different type of donors, different type of material, and so on, and mass range. So these are the objects. What do we do with them? Well, my main focus of work is observational, and since the bulk of the emission of these sources is in the X-ray part of the spectrum, it mostly involves X-ray astronomy. However, it is impossible to study this comprehensively if you don't back it up with multi-wavelength studies, since this allows you to understand the connection of these sources with their host galaxies, and also they indeed emit throughout the spectrum. So as all astronomers, we, in a source by source cases, we analyze the spectra, we analyze the light curves of the sources, and we try to understand the mechanisms of how they work, using any statistical method in order to gain the more credible answers to our questions. Now, if you want to move in a bigger scale, then I'm also interested in the study of these sources as populations, meaning, for example, exploring, and this is kind of an ad here for my work I'm actually paid for, which is to explore the treasures inside those catalogs. So today I'm going to talk about my work, my personal, my research, my own research, but well, XMM pays me to produce catalogs and to debug this awful software that people that have to use XMM Newton know of. So if you want to blame someone, blame me. Anyway, for XMM, which is the latest catalog, is out. So go check it out and find those treasures that are hidden inside it. Now, finally, I started kind of unorthodox in my career a bit. I don't know if it's unorthodox, but some people say it is. So I worked with Apostolos, who is a theorist. I then worked with Sunayev and Gilvanov, who are also theoretical, but I always was lured by the dark side of observations. However, I still am interested in the modeling of radiative processes, and I believe is a crucial part to develop simulations that will let us poke at specific physics that can give us a better understanding of what we observe. All right, so let's start with a very quick overview of what we see from these sources and how we analyze the data we get to order to understand how the mechanism works. So main source of emission, as we said, in black hole binaries of any kind, or neutron star binaries, or of course AGN, is the accretion disk. This produces primarily thermal emission. However, we also see non-thermal emission from these objects, which we attribute to some sort of corona of hot electrons. What I mean by that, so I think this will become clearer. We have here a simple sketch of an accreting compact object. During certain stages, which we call the hard state of these objects, the accretion disk can recede from the central compact object. And this results in the formation of this radial advection-dominated flow, if you like, that promotes the presence of very hot, optically thin electrons. Now, these electrons can upscatter photons that come from the disk, for example, in a process known as thermal comptonization. Observationally, if you like, we see power laws with exponential cutoffs, and the process of comptonization is exactly the process that will give us the observed effect. So we don't know exactly the geometry of this corona. We don't know if this sketch is anywhere close to the truth, but we do know that these objects, back up a bit, are either dominated by hard or soft emission. They're intermediate states, but let's not complicate it, which has to do with whether the disk goes further inside in the soft state where its emission dominates, or if there's a higher corona that gives you the power law continuum. So you have non-thermal emission from this corona, the thermal emission from a disk that looks like a black body, but is a combination of black bodies. You can imagine this as concentric rings of different temperatures, if you like, which gives us a spectrum that I've clumsily modeled here with XSpec, which could be a combination of a thermal component and power law. And this little thing here, which I'll explain right now. Now, this is the primary emission I described, the continuum, a non-thermal part and a thermal part, disk and corona. This primary emission, though, a fraction of it can be reflected off the accretion disk, basically reprocessed by the disk. The disk is optically thick, and the material that is incident on the surface is mostly absorbed. However, this absorption happens primarily due to ionization of heavy elements, basically K-shell ionization, the inner electrons of heavy elements such as iron or carbon or oxygen. This results in the emission of fluorescent lines, characteristic of the energy of these elements. So the primary emission reflected of the disk, as you can see here in this Monte Carlo simulation, is heavily absorbed. So this is the, like, assuming here a power law spectrum that starts from the corona, and this is the reflected emission. As you can see, it's orders of magnitude less. Most of it is absorbed, but the fraction that makes it out of the disk due to scattering and fluorescence is enriched with multiple emission lines. These could be lines of carbon, of oxygen, and of iron. Now, unfortunately, we often cannot detect most of this line. And the reason is, particularly in X-ray binaries, we register the primary emission, that red Carlo, along with the reflected emission, and those lines are heavily diluted by those photons. Although in AGN, you can have in AGN an obscuration of the primary source that can give you a glimpse of that reflection spectrum. In X-ray binaries, usually we see something like this if we are really, really lucky. This is an observation of a very bright black hole X-ray binary. So as you can see, we see a smooth spectrum, in this case described by Carlo. These features here are instrumental, don't worry about them. We're still working on them after 10 years. And of course, you have the interstellar absorption in the back. So in this smooth spectrum, you see some X's. Here we have the ratio plot, divide the best fit model with the data. This axis is the indication for the presence of the iron line. This is usually the main emission line we detect from this object, because it's located for neutral iron at 6.4 keV, and it has the highest fluorescence yield, and it's the brightest of these lines. And this line has tremendous importance for the history of accretion, the observational history of accreting objects in terms of its power as a diagnostic of accretion. Primarily its shape and its strength can give us all sorts of information about the accretion disk and even the central object. For example, there are predictions of how that line should behave in the case of a spinning or a non-spinning black hole. It was actually this emission line coming from now an accretion disk in a supermassive black hole in AGN that really put the nail on the whole subject of the presence of supermassive black holes, which I found surprising was in 1995. It was when we detected this gravitationally broadened iron emission line that could only be attributed, or more convincingly be attributed, to the presence of a very compact, very massive central object. So the process of X-ray reflection is one of the main diagnostic tools for accretion, and this is something I've worked on since the start of my career. So I've worked on this both observationally, and I've produced numerical simulations in order to probe these the effects, if you like, of the composition, also the accretion disk on these emission lines, and what more can we understand about the entire process. Now this, and of course a lot of observations, has led to different types of works which I don't want to bother you with, so I will just mention a more recent result we have, which is I'm quite excited about, because this is a work we've been doing with two of my students, and also it's something that's been working on for a long time, which involves a possible new diagnostic. So I mentioned the presence of the iron line, which is usually the only line detected. But after a very copious research of basically the entire X-ray binary catalog, primarily in XMM Newton, we point out the presence of, not an unknown, certainly has been discussed before, of an emission-like feature that appears to be broad, centered around 1 keV. So people have mentioned this, and people have tried to interpret it in source-by-source cases, but we have found that it's so ubiquitous that it is actually, it could actually be a diagnostic tool in itself. And especially since it does not seem to be explained purely by our concept until now of just reflection, which we attributed the presence of emission lines. Now, to further probe these features, we then run, and we're doing this for some time, a search for these emission lines in more high resolution spectra using the RGS, the grating spectrometer instrument of XMM Newton. Details are not necessarily important. The point is that in the primary broadband detectors, we have much less spectral resolution, while RGS allows us to see and break down this line. So what have we found so far? So basically what we did is we took data for the entire, almost the entire X-ray binary catalog, and we did a blind search for emission and absorption lines. And then we used, in the cases of where the statistics were not good enough, in some cases they are actually pretty good in X-ray binaries, simulations to estimate how significant they were. So what have we discovered so far? And this is still a work in progress. Well, it appears in some cases that we have narrow emission lines there, while the iron line, for example, can be broadened. So that hints to a different origin of these lines. But sometimes we also see some broadened, unresolved lines, unresolved even with RGS, and narrow emission lines, so multiple origins. We have some indications of these sources being broadened not due to the rotation of the accretion disk or gravitational effects, for example, in neutron stars or pulsars in which the disk is quite far from the central object, which then hints to a different mechanism for broadening. And it was Basco in 1980 that had actually discussed broadening of these lines, not just because of reflection of the disk. We've attempted some time resolved spectroscopy, and especially, and we've done this with Yorgos. The statistics are not as good, but and so we are still open on how these lines behave in respect with time. So some very tentative conclusions then. First of all, this concept of a corona. It has been argued a long time that this is something more complicated than this simplistic assumption I showed you before. And we seem to find indication of this. We also have one of more definitive conclusion is that our current models, even the most sophisticated reflection models, cannot explain self-consistently the presence of the 1 kV line and the iron line. And this could also explain another problem we have. Basically, in our models, we seem to need to use a high abundance of iron to explain the strength of the iron line in many sources on which we observe it, which is kind of strange because sometimes we need more than 4 or 5 times the iron we see in the sun, which makes it a bit peculiar. What we come down, if there's one major important finding from this, and this will be published as soon as I can get my students to finish the loose ends, is that there are strong indications that emission lines from all types of X-ray binaries are not necessarily the result of reflection. And if the broadening of lines and the presence of lines are the result of some optically thin plasma, for example, that's doing emission, which can be the case in, certainly is the case actually in X-ray pulsars, then this will put some stress on estimations we've made on the mass of central objects or black holes, assuming that the broadening of lines was just due to spin of the accretion disk. So in 1991, when RGS was where XMM Newton was about to fly, Vritlek had said that the RGS, the high energy spectrum spectroscopy, will give us a wealth of information about the emission lines in the soft part of the spectrum, given its very high resolution. Well, now I was toying around with the idea of saying Koliopanos here instead of gold. So I will repeat this argument, saying now we need to exhaust, and we are doing that, exhausting the capabilities of our current telescopes, preparing for the next generation telescope like Athena and XIFU, which will have a calorimeter. As you can see here, the effective area of the XIFU compared to the XMM Newton and the X-arm, which will also go, which will also be very interesting in these sort of projects, and the excellent spectral resolution that we'll get within this 1 kV complex. So this sort of work, and I will speak about it in a few minutes in future projects, must involve a complete analysis of the data we have and modeling producing new simulations that will be able to expect what the wealth of information that we're going to get from Athena and XIFU. All right, so this was a kind of a introduction, if you like, in the sort of things one can do with X-ray spectroscopy as a diagnostic of accretion. But before I lose my audience, let's do a reminder of what we started talking about. So we want to understand how supermassive black holes form. And we mentioned two key concepts: super Eddington accretion and intermediate mass black holes. So what about the super Eddington accretion? What have we been doing about that? Well, the best candidates we have for super Eddington accretion is sources known as ultra luminous X-ray sources, or ULX. Well, these are bright X-ray sources that exceed a luminosity of a few times 10 to the 39 x per second. There's no physics behind that. That's the luminosity of the Eddington luminosity of a 20 solar mass black hole. So these sources sometimes are hundreds or even thousands of times brighter than the Eddington limit for a stellar sized black hole. And they are almost all extragalactic and have been, and they are, of course, non-central black holes. There wouldn't be anything weird about an AGN with such high luminosity. So initially, people thought these were prime example of intermediate mass black holes. So these are not just super Eddington black holes, they're just more massive black holes. If you get a black hole of 1,000 solar masses, then the Eddington limit is much higher than the 10 to the 39. Without going into details, decades of research has shown that this is most likely not the case. These seem to be in a specific accretion state of their own, and they have a very characteristic spectra, as we'll briefly mention. And so the main scenario until quite recently was that these are prime examples of super Eddington accreting black holes. Until quite recently, relatively recently, it was like 6 years ago actually, we discovered a pulsating ULX. And since then we've discovered many more, and actually I should cite a few more people here because there are new ones. In any case, these sources that were looked identical to ULXs, and that's something to remember, and that had been overlooked in the past. We decided that we understood that they have pulsations of the X-ray emission. And that's a crucial thing because pulsations and the exact characteristic of these pulsations point to one thing: a surface of a neutron star and a strong magnetic field. And this is exciting and weird at the same time. So this confirms that super Eddington accretion is possible. If you have a 10 to the 40 x per second neutron star, for which you know cannot be higher than 2 solar masses, at 2.1, I don't remember what the limit is exactly, then you have to have it accreting hundreds of times, sometimes above the Eddington limit. But, which of course begs the question as to how is that possible? And perhaps the presence of magnetic field is the reason for this. So I will just very quickly, and we'll not go into all these details I have in this slide, just briefly touch on what happens to accretion disks when a high magnetized neutron is involved, a neutron star is involved. In this case, you have an extended magnetosphere, and we're talking here about 10 to the 12 Gauss, this type of magnetic fields. Someplace the magnetic field pressure will become equal to the ramp pressure of the infalling gas. At this place, you have interruption of the accretion disk. And what we expect to happen is that the materials then is quote unquote captured by the magnetic field lines, forming a sort of structure of a column of accreting material that falls on the pole of the neutron star. Now, this is very high temperature as the material gains energy, and any process between electrons and photon basically is scattering. And an addition to that is that there's a high anisotropy basically of the scattering cross section in the presence of magnetic fields. Without going into details, I will just say that this results basically in most of the photons produced as the material is falling onto the pole of the neutron star being emitted in a sort of tight beam parallel to the magnetic field axis. So as this beamed emission, as this object rotates, and if there's an inclination between the rotational axis and the magnetic field axis, this results in us registering the emission with pulsations. Now, this is the mechanism that gives us X-ray pulsations in highly magnetized neutron stars. And the same mechanism, and I'm definitely not going to bother you with all the details here, can allow, and we've known this since the 70s, a way to circumvent the Eddington limit. Basically, this anisotropy in the scattering cross-section can end up in the material actually escaping through the sides of this accretion funnel. And it just to not go into details, you can very roughly describe this as a circumventing the Eddington limit by material falling in, following the magnetic field lines, and emission escaping from sides of this accretion funnel. So in this case, you can sustain super Eddington accretion. And this has some characteristics. We have some spectrum we expect from the X-ray pulsars, from what happens inside the accretion column, and the shape of these pulses, which usually, this is from work with Yorgos, they have a complex shape with multiple peaks. This is what we know for X-ray pulsars that reach this limit and they exceed the Eddington limit. So now we have, so that's what X-ray pulsars do. So what do ULXs do? Could this mechanism be used to explain these ultraluminous X-ray sources? Well, that's a personal opinion, but in another unfortunate and kind of hasty publication, it was argued that, yeah, the spectra of ULXs look very, very close to the ones of X-ray pulsars, in the sense that, you know, they have thermal and non-thermal components. However, there's one striking difference, at least for me. They all seem to be considerably softer than what we actually detect in X-ray pulsars. So I have in this crude plot here different spectra of X-ray, of ULXs. Some are pulsating, some are not in this picture. And here some very well-known X-ray pulsars. And excuse me? No, someone's microphone, I think. There's no question. Okay. So just an indication. Anyway, we started doing this more systematically, looking at the spectra of multiple ULXs. Present here an image of this, which is not from our study, so I don't want to be biased. And what we came out with was that they don't exactly look like what we expect for X-ray pulsars. They seem to be comprised by two thermal components, and they have sometimes some faint parallel tails. And also the pulse profiles are smooth and sinusoidal, nothing like what we'd expect from these X-ray pulsars. So we were in this state in this study where we were trying to reconcile these differences with the fact that we have a mechanism in X-ray pulsars that can allow for super Eddington accretion, and the fact that we see now pulsating ULXs. But how can we combine the two? And as we were working on this, Mushtokov and their team came up with a theoretical consideration that demonstrated that if you increase the rate corresponding to luminosities above 10 to the 39, basically the entire magnetosphere of a neutron star can be engulfed in optically thick material. And this material can actually mask the original emission of the X-ray pulsar. So what we basically argued with, along with, based on these predictions, was that the spectra we see, we have thermal emission coming from a very hot curtain around the entire magnetosphere of the neutron star, and a secondary thermal component, perhaps from a truncated accretion disk. You can argue differently, but in any case, this is one assumption. And what we argued was that this process can make super Eddington neutron star, accreting magnetized neutron stars appear to look different than what we expect for standard X-ray pulsars, and also hide pulsations. And based on that, we published the first, to my knowledge, systematic observational studies in which we argued that perhaps the biggest fraction of ULXs is actually powered by neutron stars rather than black holes, whether they pulsate or not. And this was kind of brought some tensions, but now it's actually considered a very credible scenario. Now, this mechanism I described might not be the case. There's been other mechanisms proposed, but more and more we tend to agree that neutron stars, highly magnetized neutron stars, are the sources of the only candidates we have of confirmed super Eddington accretion. Now, I'm proud of this work for two reasons. First of all, because it was, it was contentious, but then became more, more and more the norm, but also because this started my collaboration with Yorgos Vassilopoulos, and then has taken a life of its own. We are leading papers, one or the other, trying to unify these two populations. So, and Yorgos is a good friend, and it's like from my generation. So it's a nice thing to be able to work together. In any case, what does this mean? So for supermassive black holes, for example, well, if indeed ULXs are prime examples of black holes persistently thinking about the Eddington limit are actually magnetized neutron star, raises questions like, so do we need magnetic fields? Is the Eddington path still viable? I have no answer to that, and I have no reason to expect that not, but it's a very interesting finding in respect to this mechanism. So obviously, this is something we will keep looking into. All right, a second reminder, because I've kind of exploded all over the place. Right, how are supermassive black holes are made? We need super Eddington accretion. I mentioned an example of how we can study this mechanism using X-ray binaries. What about the intermediate mass black holes? The second part of these questions, the relics of those initial seeds. How do we go about finding this? Well, the most direct way would be to try to measure black holes in other galaxies. And the more direct way is, well, the direct measurement, dynamic measurement. Unfortunately, this is quite hard. We can do it for our galaxy, and after years of efforts, there's a mega maser case in which you have gas emitting again, you need bright and nearby galaxies, and you have making certain assumptions about circumnuclear gas. You can estimate by broadening of lines the velocity of the surrounding gas, and by blue shift and red shift of lines, but blue shift and red shift of lines, the velocity of these lines, and given the size of these regions, you can estimate the mass of the central black holes. Now, you can also use a collective motion of gases in general, but there's many assumptions you have to make, including that they're virialized, that are spherical. In any case, the main problem is, and this is another nice exercise for students, is that the sphere of influence of black holes, and this is given by Peebles here in terms of the velocity dispersion of that around, is very small. And as you go to the low mass regime, it's basically impossible to resolve with our telescopes. Now you can increase your resolution a bit with reverberation mapping, a very smart thing, very nice thing. So you have the broadline region, a region a bit further out of the black holes where you have velocity broadened lines. You can get the velocity of this region. And these lines are the result of basically reflection of emission from the primary X-ray emission from the accreting black hole in the center. Now we're talking about the supermassive black hole. And any fluctuation in this emission is reflected with, well, a time delay, light time delay at this from the broadline region. So if we can have accurate enough and long-term observations, we can have the size of the region and the velocity, and then use Kepler's law to get the mass. Again, this is quite demanding in terms of observing time and also targets. So it's no surprise that in the low mass regime, we basically have only a handful of estimations, and they are all contentious. So we can use some more indirect methods. So I will not bother you with details here, but there's a series of well-established scaling relations. Now using optical observations here, we don't care about whether the black hole is accreting or not, between the mass of the central black hole and characteristics of the host galaxy. For example, the well-known M sigma relation, the relation between the black hole and the velocity dispersion of the inner bulge. That could actually be an effect, at least Andy King believes so, of an older super Eddington phase, that this velocity dispersion is the result of outflows in the past when these were active black holes, for example. In any case, this can be used for further objects, which you only have to do a spectroscopy for the velocity dispersion of the bulbs. If you want to go a bit further out, you can use a relation that actually preceded this one, known as the mass-luminosity relation. This is mass versus the luminosity of the central bulbs. Of course, you have to know the distance in this case. And there are more recent additions to that, like a relation between the mass of the black hole and the Sersic index. This is basically a parameterization of the brightness profile of the galaxy, or even the tightness of the spiral angles in spiral galaxies. So all these relations can give you estimations of the black hole mass. However, they have one major problem in most of them, which is that they're biased towards high masses because they're populated by more massive and more bright objects. This is something that is necessarily true. Now, if the central black hole is accreting, we can use this process to estimate the mass. Apart from the obvious Eddington limit, if you have an Eddington accreting mass black hole, you can infer its mass. Perhaps more interestingly, in more moderately accreting black holes, the ones that I showed before with the big corona and the hard state with a non-thermal emission, which is usually the state that involves the presence of the jet, we have found that there is a correlation forming a plane, basically a 3D plane of fundamental black hole, fundamental plane of black hole activity between the radial luminosity, the X-ray luminosity from the disk, the radius from the Z, and the mass of the black hole. And this seems to extend from all the way to X-ray binaries, basically, up to supermassive black holes. So this relation can also give you an estimation of the mass of the black hole, albeit with considerable scatter. So where I'm going with this, so we have multiple methods, all have their problems, but perhaps we could combine them in order to test each method and also get a more robust estimation, which is exactly what we did a few years ago, basically motivated by recent estimations of intermediate mass black holes in some low luminosity AGN in our neighborhood, nearby galaxies. We combined all these methods for a set of galaxies in order to confirm these results. And what we found was that, and that was the main, is that this method not only produced more robust results, but we, for the first time, tested how consistent these methods are in the low mass regime. So there was a pilot study, not in many sources, but it produced hope for the future, if you like. We found that we can produce a more robust estimation. For that sample, we actually realized that these are not intermediate mass black holes. And indeed, the author that first argued that went back and realized that the mass luminosity relation he used to do that needed tweaking. So so we didn't find it in intermediate mass black holes, but we did find a powerful tool to estimate mass of black holes in the low mass regime, in which, as you can see, we have trouble, scarcity of information. This is a plot of mass of black hole versus in terms of absolute size. It's basically a mass luminosity diagram. This is our sources, these sources from the literature. And as you can see, as we go to 10 to the 6, 10 to the 5, 10 to the 4, we have, well, one candidate, perhaps. So the outlook from that was that we need to combine this approach with simulations in order to try and study the demographic and the intermediate mass black holes. What I mean by that, we can make some predictions of what we expect the M sigma relation, for example, to do in the low mass regime, depending on what the seeds of the black holes are. Basically, if we start only from massive seeds, we expect to see this relation stopping around 10 to the 5, 10 to the 6 solar masses. Otherwise, we need to be able to find a population of smaller intermediate mass black holes. So what do we see right now? Well, this is what we see right now observationally. We have our M sigma relation and this plume of sources between 10 to the 5, 10 to the 6. That could mean that indeed The massive seed scenario is the more prominent one. But that also shows something else. Basically, this is exactly near the limitations of instruments used to do this, which is basically spectroscopy for the M-sigma relation. So based on the pilot study we did a few years ago, I am proposing, and that brings me to my future project, a more massive study, a different scale study, in order to check this, in order to probe the low mass regime in central mass black holes. And what I propose to do is the complete census of the central mass, of the central black holes, and I have an M small here, that massive, not necessarily supermassive. I hope to find intermediate mass black holes in all nearby low luminosity EGN, nearby meaning within 50 megaparsec. What we want to do is collect the wealth of information that there is for these sources and use this methodology in order to see what's going on in the low mass regime. And the first question, of course, for that is it feasible? With a student of mine, not last year, the year before, we spent a year working on this, and we've collected a sample of almost 3,000 galaxies within 50 megaparsecs, for which we have abundant observations in X-ray, optical, infrared, and radio. So what we need to perform this test. So yes, we can do it. Problem is, the scale explodes of this project. We need X-ray and radio spectroscopy in order to weed out those emissions that is not part of an accreting black hole. We need to decompose the brightness profile of galaxies in order to find the central bulge. We need to estimate the spiral angle, the pitch angle. And although we have developed tools to do that on a source-by-source cases, applying it to a sample of 3,000 galaxies with multiple observations in each needs a different approach. And that approach basically puts us in this, modern concept of machine learning algorithms. What we've been working on, and this is a big collaboration now, is to prepare a concept study to begin for the start, which we will be testing, of automating this process, of taking our algorithms and basically increasing the efficiency by hundreds of times. And to do this, we need to basically money and manpower. First step for this exercise is to develop these codes and then run the analysis on thousands of sources and then apply our understanding and the most advanced scaling relations in order to produce mass measurements from this entire sample. So I have here the names of my core collaborators here, which deal with different parts of it, from the profile analysis to the machine learning algorithms and so on and so forth. So this is a project which is definitely not small, and it will definitely take some time. In the end, though, I think it can pay off. At the least, we will have the first large-scale estimation of all central mass black holes in confirmed AGN. A quick example is all these galaxies that we attributed, we thought were active, are they indeed active in the near universe? This is another test we can do. But also, and this is a theme, I guess, of mine, we will test the limitations of our observation facilities. When this is done, this is the best we will be able to do with these telescopes. And to be honest, my ultimate goal after this project would be to have prepared the sample of a next generation of these exercises with Athena and the square kilometer array, the next generation of telescopes, which are primarily run by European countries, also is of interest. So basically, I've plotted here, I'm not the first one to do this, another version of the fundamental plane, if you like. So I won't bother you with main details. Basically, you have a flux of the radio here. Instead of X-ray luminosity, we assume a low luminosity AGN, 10 to the -3 to 10 to the -5 Eddington. And I've plotted here a distance. And this is the estimation of where we expect black holes of 10 to the 5 solar masses to lie and 10 to the 4 solar masses. And the width of it depends on how luminous they are, less luminous they are not. This is the detection limit of VLA, 5 sigma, and this is the detection limit of SCA. What does this mean? Well, that means that we will be able, with very short observing bursts, to get unprecedented sensitivity, basically detect, as a minus here, black holes of mass of, oh no, there's no minus, less than 10 to the 4 solar masses at very low luminosities within this distance of 50 megaparsecs. In other words, if these low mass seeds exist in the real universe, we'll find them. But to do that, and to convince this consortia to give us the time, we first need to do the study with what we currently have from all these treasures of astronomical catalogs, as Natalie has put it. So this is a future project I'm interested in the quest for seeds of black holes. What about the ULXs? What about, and I'm coming closer to an end, what about the accretion diagnostics and what we expect for next generation telescopes? Well, we talked about this reflection spectrum and a wealth of lines that we expect, and we actually observed in most X-ray binaries as a result of this, of this process. However, all known ULXs are surprisingly smooth. We've never seen any emission lines, well, apart from some close to the 1 kV, which makes the previous project interesting. But in general, we've never observed iron emission line from ULXs, which is peculiar, especially since we find that they are definitely some of them that are pulsating, and X-ray pulsars have some of the strongest iron emission lines. It becomes even more peculiar if we consider the main scenario for supermassive black holes, for ULXs as super Eddington accreting black holes, which involves the inflation of the accretion disk due to the super Eddington regime and the formation of a funnel of optically thick material that guides the emission sort of like a flashlight towards our point of view. This is one of the main arguments, apart from what I discussed before with neutron stars, that wants to explain ULX high luminosities. Basically, the high luminosity is the result of moderate super Eddington accretion and the fact that we just happen to be in the line of sight of the most luminous sources. And if we were to see them from a different direction, they would look like softer and less luminous sources. If this is the case, then this predicts a considerably much higher reflection from the sides of this accretion funnel. And unless these sides are behave like a mirror, a perfect mirror, we should see emission lines, fluorescent lines, as we do in disks, but we don't. And this is something I think needs to be tested. On the other hand, in the concept I described about these optically thick cocoons around neutron stars, these again are analytic estimations we have, semi-analytic models. We don't have a self-consistent radiative transfer code. And so why don't we have these codes? Well, the reason is that very computationally expensive, especially if you want to do in the optically thick regime, you need a lot of computational power. So I've been toying around with this, and this takes me to the final future idea I'm working on. And just with naive analytical arguments, it's not so straightforward to convince oneself that this reflective surface is indeed optically thick, but fully ionized, and no emission lines come from it. So this needs to be modeled using Monte Carlo simulation, in my opinion. And the same thing goes for the increasing optical depth around the magnetosphere of neutron stars. Perhaps this could give us answers as to how we move from the optically thin case of a standard X-ray pulsar to this contraption of, in the case of ULXs. So basically, you need a code in which you have atoms and electrons and photonization and fluorescence and scattering and lots of scattering. And this is very hard. And until now, we've done it, we, meaning personally and other people, but in a much more basic level. However, there was a recent revolution, if you like, in consumer GPUs. These are graphics cards. Gamers among the crowd might know that. A next generation of GPUs that are moderately priced, that can actually really speed up our ray tracing codes. Now, this is not new. GPUs have been used, but the astrophysics community is quite behind that. Well behind from our high energy colleagues, for example. But and I think we should get on board. So this is another project I'm looking into. Combine these new powerful GPUs to create from scratch these next generation Monte Carlo simulations. And that from scratch is the key word, because that's a reason many people don't move from the CPU based simulations to GPU. There are not as many libraries, for example. However, there are more and more being built, and there are many modules available. And the thing is, these new graphics cards are designed to do just that, real-time ray tracing. And to be honest, my absolute goal is actually to be able to do real-time spectrum modeling and fitting. What I mean by that, so usually when we have a Monte Carlo simulation and we want to fit data, we run our code for hours or weeks or days or weeks. We create tables for a very specific set of quite simplified geometries and physical characteristics, and then we use these tables to fit spectra. But what I want to test is and from very quick back of the envelope estimation, it seems plausible, is to have a code that will do this in real time, a Monte Carlo code that will be able to create within a given parameter space real-time points in order to fit observational data. In any case, I think this is an essential package we need to build if we're going to exploit what we expect to get from XARM, and in the far future well, hopefully not that far, from XIFU. This is a part of an ongoing discussion I have with Didier, which is the director of XIFU. Friends seem to separate theory from observation, and we are the observers and not theorists, but I think this is wrong. I think we should really prepare this because we'll get an overwhelming amount of data which we cannot interpret with our current tools. We cannot even interpret, well, the current data basically, as we are finding out with this 1 kV feature. So this is another set of pictures about the complexity of these things and how these simulations should help us resolve them. Now, something I always wanted to do is consider real-time feedback between the electrons and the photons, ionization state, but I won't go into there. Anyway, so I think I need to wrap it up. So I will give you a summary of what I talked about, because I don't want to leave people too confused, or more than they're actually confused. Well, first, a deep breath, because we made it through this kind of extended talk. So I set up some premises. Accretion power sources play a very crucial role in the shape of the universe. I also, that to understand how this happens, we need to understand how supermassive black holes form. And if there's one takeaway message from this is, as far as I'm concerned, is we need to look at population of intermediate mass black holes and the concept of super Eddington accretion, and in order to answer these questions. And to do this, at least from my point of view, I think we should combine the spectral and temporal analysis of X-ray binaries and AGN, develop new diagnostics, and please take advantage of the wealth of information that lies in catalogs that still has been very least utilized than it should have. So this is the end of my talk. I leave you with a thank you note and a note to attend Yorgos' seminar in November. Yorgos is my main collaborator, especially in the part of the ULXs, and there's a whole temporal analysis of these things, and that I will leave to Yorgos to explain. So please go to his talk, and so that's it for me. Thank you very much for listening to my perhaps longer than average talk.
Thank you, Felipe. That was very interesting. Do we have questions for Filippo? Maria?
Yes, Felipe.
Yes, Maria.
Hi. So this was a very interesting talk, and although I have followed some of your projects about ULXs, I have two questions. The first one is related to the project that you described with your graduate students and the detection of emission lines from optically thin plasma. So you mentioned that if you find robust evidence for these emission lines coming from optically thin plasma, you could explain, or you could expect some differences in the estimated mass of the black holes when this is done using the reflection method, assuming that you have optically thick plasma.
Yeah, this is the more like, you know, the optimistic version, the most impactful version of the work, yes. Right? But we have indications, yes.
And I was wondering how much of a difference do you expect to have in the estimated masses? So will it be like a factor of 10 or something? So do you have a quantitative estimate of that?
Not really, and I'll tell you why. It's because we already have quite a bit of uncertainty. There's already two schools of thought, right? So you have estimations from reflection, and this problem is mostly to X-ray binaries, right? Things are more clear in AGN where you have the gravitational broadening. So you have some estimations from line broadening, assuming these reflections, but you also have the people, and these are, I remember late McClintock in Harvard was talking to me about this, using the continuum emission, basically the emission of the disk. These two methods already give quite different results, and updates of these methods already have a tension that could be more than a few times difference. Now, in our case, what I'm seeing is that some features that look like a broadened emission feature that indicates a very high velocity in the accretion disk, meaning therefore a very small inner radius, could actually be the case of microscopic broadening. If this is the case, in some of them, in some cases, it seems like that, then it could be even more than a factor of 10. Basically, we see something which we attribute to a rapidly spinning disk, and that's not the case. Now, it's convoluted, right? To completely solve it, I believe we need the high resolution instruments. And I'll finish here to give people time to ask more questions. We see now that we definitely cannot explain all these features just by reflection. So there has to be some other origin of these emission lines. To give you a more precise answer on that, this is what we're looking for, is to find this origin, right? But if it is microscopic broadening, then yeah, we could have a serious problem, at least in some cases.
And I have another question, which is probably shorter. It's related to the last part of your talk about the ray tracing Monte Carlo method that you described.
Mhm.
And I was wondering if you have an idea of how you're going to do this analysis when you have the central source rotating. So in that sense, you are going to have a time-dependent illumination of this optically thick material. So do you think that this Monte Carlo method will apply or can be extended somehow to this case? Or are you going to study non-pulsating ULXs with that?
That is a very good question. To be honest, I was thinking of to begin with in a static case. See, I've made some rough estimations of how fast this thing can be, but I'm not really sure. Right, this has to be
Yes.
tested. So all estimations is for something static. Ideally, yes, that would be perfect if you could just see how basically, if what Mustikov says can happen. Basically, you can blur out the pulsations. But what I plan to do by that is find a very talented student to work with
Okay.
on the code. That's my
Okay, so
first plan.
yes, thank you.
Yeah, welcome.
So Andrea Zezas has a question, I think.
Yeah, it's a related question to this narrow lines or to this line features that we see in the softband, which sound very, very interesting. So you mentioned that some of these lines cannot be explained by reflection. So could those be related to either collisionally or a photoionized material just around the black hole, for example, from a wind, from a
Yes,
okay.
yes.
So,
We have also indications of blue shift sometimes, and these features can also give you, under right circumstances, iron emission line too. That's why I was saying could be tension with the reflection model. But yes, this is something we have indications for at least some of the sources.
So in this case, do you have a feeling, or do you think that it is possible to reconcile whether these are collisionally ionized, which would tell us that they are around, like in the circumstellar material, or if they're photoionized, which will tell us that it's much closer to the black hole, in an analogy to what is seen in AGN, in X-ray observations of nearby AGN?
So I hesitate to give an answer now. See, my student presented a few months ago tests of exactly this nature, trying to see if we are talking about collisional ionization or photonization. But we need to have many more checks to see. Basically, I don't trust his fits. There are indications of that for sure, but I'm hesitant. Another thing I want to add is that from the entire sample, and this we're talking primarily by RGS, it's a handful of sources that we have such good statistics that allows us to do this. But because this is a work in progress, I don't think we have a clear answer yet. But this is definitely a very specific test we are enacting at this point. And exactly what you said, this similarity to the AGN analog.
Okay, thank you.
No, you're welcome.
Any other questions for Filippo? Questions? Well, while people are thinking, I have one.
Yes.
Do you think, regarding to finding the intermediate mass black holes, I don't know about instruments and sensitivities, but do you think the gravitational wave detection from mergers has any role to play and any interesting constraints to place on that mass range?
You mean the current gravitational wave
future,
detector source?
Are we expecting any input from the gravitational wave people on this problem?
Adonis actually could also have some input on that. What I know is that I don't know if our current instruments can go to the scales of the 1,000 solar masses. We already have something very interesting, right? The hundreds of solar masses we saw from the, from the most recent estimation. I think, if my understanding is correct from the white papers, are that LISA will be much more suited to probe this regime. And and we are talking here about the, at least the ones I'm looking for, the intermediate mass black holes in centers of galaxies, right? Not just necessarily a product of collision and a massive black hole in a globular cluster or someone around the galaxy, which definitely can be the case, but in black holes that are most likely already at the 1,000 solar mass range or higher. So I don't think that mergers of black holes of this size can be picked up by the current gravitational wave detectors, but I think LISA might be able to detect that. But I don't know if Adonis wants to pitch in on that. Maybe we can have a more definite answer. Okay, maybe Adonis not. One more thing, James Webb argues that might actually be able to directly look, because this project basically says, look, we want to find the seeds, far away seeds, far back in the history of the universe by looking now in our neighborhood, because we cannot see directly. But James Webb, they've argued that if this direct collapse scenario is the case, there are some specific predictions, which I apologize, I don't remember exactly what these are, about these gas formations that form the progenitor of this 100,000 solar mass black hole, that can be, in principle, tested by James Webb. Now, if James Webb doesn't observe something like that, doesn't mean it rules it out. But if they get really, really lucky, we might actually have a more direct observation of these early supermassive stars, as they call it, the progenitors of the seeds. It's just pointed out as a more direct approach.
Thank you. Anything else for Philippos? Well, if not, thank you very, very much again for this very interesting talk. And we're looking forward to welcoming you in person once the...
Yes, I'm also looking forward to that. And we'll definitely be able to do it at some point. I'm sure about that.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you too.